What's up, outliers? Welcome to Performance Bites for bite sized insights into complex subjects in health and performance. Today, we're going to break down the difference in different interval style training. So, a lot of the times we hear interval training, it kind of gets lumped into like HIIT. We hear HIIT a lot, which is high intensity interval training. We hear just the common interval training, and then also VO2 max training. All of these are basically interval style training, which are going to improve different facets in the body, whether it's an anaerobic or aerobic, depending upon the intensity that the intervals are done at and also the duration mixed in with the rest. So that's kind of what we're going to go over. We're going to break down the difference of the work, the intensities, the rest, and also the adaptations that are occurring during each of these different styles of training. Now, the first one that we're going to go over is HIIT. So, high intensity interval training, very popular, very widely used, and also something that's used a lot in group fitness and stuff like that because you can basically pack in a lot of work into a short amount of time. And typically, this is going to be done in short intervals as well, from like 20 to 30 seconds, maybe up to a minute, depending upon what you're doing. But the point of it usually is to put out a high amount of effort, about 85% up to 100% effort, which I really want to be clear on that. That's an effort comparatively to a heart rate. So we'll talk a little bit with heart rate and we'll talk a little bit with effort. And effort is a perceived thing. So everybody has a different RPE, rate of perceived effort. But in high intensity interval training, since it's such a short duration of a high intensity burst, typically the individual is not going to be able to reach a high heart rate of like 85 to 100% of their maximum heart rate because the duration of work just isn't quite long enough in that 20 to 30 seconds. But you can at least put in a high effort of your 85% to 100% effort, which is very important to kind of separate those things because when we start talking about VO2 max, we'll really be making sure that we're identifying this through heart rate more than effort. Now, the primary energy system that's being used when they first begin the high intensity interval is going to be your ATP creatine phosphate. So this is only an energy system that lasts about 10 seconds, very high, big burst. But once we surpass that, the body is going to essentially have to reduce its effort ever so slightly and switch into an anaerobic glycolysis, which is going to be a carbohydrate fueled system. And that system can last up to about 2 minutes. And once we start to surpass that again, we're going to break into different energy systems. But since we're talking about burst of energy and effort up to, 30 to 60 seconds, we're not going to have to break out of that anaerobic glycolysis. So we get to use carbohydrates. But with that being the case, we're going to also be producing a lot of metabolic byproduct and lactate, which is going to essentially slow us down, create a change inside of our body. Usually, we identify that with a burn in our body and the muscles start to fatigue, we feel maybe a little bit pumped up and stuff like that, and that's also to do a lot with hydrogen building up in the system. Now, the body does that for good reason when it builds up a lot of metabolic byproduct because essentially it's making sure that our blood doesn't get too acidic, which is problematic. But also at the same time, our liver can only buffer so much lactate because essentially what happens is when we're burning carbohydrate for fuel, there's a breakdown of the six carbon molecule, which is glucose, and that gets broken down into a bunch of different things and then used to create ATP at the mitochondria. So when we're doing that, all those carbons are out there and hydrogen will attach to the carbon and create lactate. And the body and the liver can only basically buffer that hydrogen off of the lactate so much through the Cori cycle. But that's kind of the beauty of training in this way is you're actually creating a better lactate threshold and creating better buffering through the training and the adaptations that are occurring. Now, of course, they're going to be uncomfortable. Maybe your effort is going to stay the same throughout the duration of your intervals, but your overall work output might change. So, say you're doing this on a bike and you're reading this in wattage, your first interval might be 500 watts. The second interval might start to drop down to 470, 440, 430, 420, and so forth, so forth. So your rate of perceived effort is going to remain the same of that 85 to 100%, which is really important to note. But your overall work output is going to reduce. But as you train yourself more and more, you're going to get a better adaptation and hopefully be able to hold more consistent power outputs. Now, as far as the rest to work ratios in this, there's a lot of variation that occurs. It really kind of depends on the mode that is being used. Because if you're doing like a sprint or something like that, you're likely going to need a little bit more rest compared to if you're doing some body weight exercises and stuff like that. So there's a couple different like terms and ways that are this is used. Like we hear like Tabata, which is usually like a 2-to-1 work the rest ratio, 45 seconds on, 22 seconds off type stuff. So it really kind of just depends because if you're sprinting for 45 seconds, there's a good chance that you're not going to be able to recover in that 20 so seconds to be able to sprint really hard again for 45 seconds. But if you sprint for 30 seconds and you give yourself 90 seconds, you're likely going to be able to at least put out a decent output. Now, it's important to really make sure that it's clear that sprint training, if you're trying to maximize overall speed and efficiency of your sprint, you actually want much, much longer rest, which is why HIIT style interval training isn't going to really be the way to maximize your sprint potential, but it doesn't mean that you can't use sprinting as a mode during the high intensity interval training. Now, if we switch over to just the general interval training away from the high intensity interval training, the biggest difference is interval training can be both aerobic and anaerobic. And so we're both going to be able to use oxygen for energy and fat for energy. And then we can also switch into higher intensity, which would be more of that anaerobic without oxygen, more carbohydrate. So it really kind of just depends on what the individual is trying to achieve. But technically, if you're still working with a 1-to-1 work, the rest ratio, you're going to still be able to have a more aerobic depending upon the intensity that is being used. Now, I'll use 1 minute of work on a bike and then 1 minute of rest. If that bike output isn't super high, call it a effort of 60 to 70% of your maximum capacity, you're going to be able to recover in that minute fairly easy comparatively to if you're doing a high intensity style, you would need much more rest. But the rules are kind of loose with interval training because what are you trying to achieve or what is your coach trying to achieve with the adaptation? Are we trying to create more mitochondrial density, more capillary density in the tissue, or are we trying to create more um, lactate threshold ability? And so that's kind of where the coach or yourself with learning this can decide what is it that I need to be better and what is it that's going to help me be better. So when we look at it that way, a lot of people will train like for aerobic sports, like a zone two, which is going to obviously build up your capacity to be able to go longer durations, which is great. But one factor that is missing within doing like a zone two for an hour is the power output tends to be fairly low. So to train for more power, but stay in an aerobic state where you're going to get stronger and actually be able to push harder through your zone two, that's where you can apply like the 1-to-1 work the rest ratio and go a little bit up with your intensity. Because typically your intensity with like a zone two training is usually going to be about 40 to 50%. Not very high. It doesn't take very much, which is why it's nice to do and it's a good recovery mode and you can actually go a long duration doing it. But if you want to still improve your aerobic ability and gain those adaptations, but you want to be maybe a little bit stronger with it or just have a different feel because going 60 minutes doing the same thing is just kind of boring, then it's not a bad idea to incorporate a 1-to-1 work to rest ratio at a 60 to 70% intensity and gain those different adaptations, which then will fall back and help you in your aerobic abilities, whether it's for cycling, running, swimming, whatever it might be. Now, the last one is VO2 max training. So, your VO2 max is a measurement in milliliters per kilogram per minute of oxygen that your body is able to take in and utilize. So, elite athletes, we can see this be as high as 75 for the standard individual. Maybe that is untrained. We can see it fairly low down in the 30s. And if you're a moderate trained athlete, maybe 40, 50. But the goal of this is to get it better because essentially what's happening is you're gaining more stroke volume from your heart to push more blood out, which carries more oxygen to the tissue, and your tissues can work better because of it. So that's obviously going to be a really great thing. It also strengthens the left ventricle, which is that pump that is going to increase that stroke volume from the heart. So the big thing with this is it's a fairly advanced method of training and it's pretty strenuous and uncomfortable. But I will say, after you do it a couple times, you start to adapt pretty well to it because the body really understands what you're trying to do. But for protocol of this, and I mentioned back when I was talking about the HIIT, was I was talking about effort over heart rate. Now, when we talk about VO2 max, we are actually talking about maximum heart rate. So that's another factor that we got to take into account here is, do you know your maximum heart rate so that you can calculate a 90 to 100% of your maximum heart rate? If you don't, the simple math that is close but not perfect is going to be 220 minus age. The younger you are, the more accurate that is. The older you are, say you're 40, 50 years old, 220 minus 50 is going to be 170. You might still be able to push a higher heart rate than 170. And because you might be a trained individual that's been doing things for a long time. So take all that with a grain of salt. The best way to find out your max heart rate would be doing a actual high intensity training where you're pushing yourself to failure, or going and doing a VO2 max test where they will push you very, very hard and you'll also find out your VO2 max, which is kind of cool. But with that being said, we want to be able to get into that 90 to 100% of our maximum heart rate to get the adaptations for our VO2 max. Time duration wise of what we're going to do this for is going to be 3 to 5 minutes. And that's where things get really challenging because a lot of people can push their heart rate up for a minute or two, but to be able to hold that duration for 3 to 5 minutes gets pretty tiring. And what really kind of happens is the mental game comes in. You got to just kind of keep fighting through it until your body starts to understand what you're doing. But when that happens, of course, it's going to be really uncomfortable and you're going to be very, very out of breath because you're working at such a high capacity. So, this is something that I don't want people to use for long, long durations. It's usually something I will implement in for an athlete for probably about 6 to 8 weeks, once a week. Obviously, the stress on the nervous system is super high because it is 90 to 100% of maximum heart rate. And typically it's going to be done for about 4 minutes for 4 rounds. So that's 16 minutes of being up in a really high heart rate. And that's super stressful on the system. So we don't want this to be like a regular thing that we do year round. Time and place is very important. Typically, we're trying to do this in like a preseason to try and maximize overall heart rate capability, but also VO2, aerobic, anaerobic capabilities and stuff like that. So protocol wise, it really depends, but you can actually break it up a little bit more too. And you can do like 2 minutes if you're new to it and do it just for a few more rounds, call it 5 rounds, 6 rounds. And you do it for 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off. And you use that ratio until you get comfortable. Then you can actually break it down a little bit more and you can do 2 minutes on, 1 minute off, 2 minutes on, 1 minute off. But you always want to make sure that you're at least staying in that higher heart rate and letting yourself get enough recovery to be able to do it again. But the big goal here is to be able to do it for about 4 minutes. The big idea of this is, like I said, getting more oxygen to the tissue so the tissue works better. And that's bringing oxygen into that mitochondria, producing more ATP, which is our main fuel source. So if we continue to build more mitochondria and we also give a lot of oxygen to those mitochondria, we just develop more energy, which is obviously going to be great for overall performance. Now, to be clear, I'm not a huge fan of actually going in and paying for a VO2 max test unless you really, really, really want to know that number, simply because even as a coach that works with a lot of athletes, I don't use that number very much as a metric of if they're getting better because we can also look at total power output or times and stuff like that to see if an individual is ultimately improving. If we're doing a VO2 max style interval training and they're out running 400s and their first 400 is at 2 minutes. And then the next time they come around to do 2 minutes, they run past the 400 and run 410 meters. There's other ways that we can see improvement that obviously shows that the VO2 max is improving rather than spending 150, $200 to go do a test. Though it's neat to have those metrics. And especially if they do like a lactate test where they like do a thumb prick and take blood, it's good to do ever so often, but it really shouldn't be like a huge deal to go in and see that you went from 50 milliliters per kilogram to 52 milliliters per kilogram. It's very obvious if you're getting better, you're feeling better, you're going further, your power's higher, whatever the case be. So I just kind of want to add that in because I don't want anyone to feel like they have to go get one of these tests done because they're not cheap. They are pretty tough to do. They're fun, but I don't think the lemon's really worth the squeeze at the end of the day. And that's coming from somebody, like I said, that works with people that the VO2 max is important, but I don't think overall it's really necessary to ultimately see improvement and change through your training. So, to basically sum this up, high intensity interval training is super high burst. There's going to be a burn. It's going to be uncomfortable. You're likely not going to recover in between, but that's the idea. And that's going to create certain adaptations that are going to obviously help with certain systems like lactate and stuff like that. While interval training is kind of like choose your own adventure. You're going to do some intervals. You're going to take your rest. You're likely going to recover better if you're trying to elicit a aerobic adaptation compared to an anaerobic adaptation. Meanwhile, a VO2 max is really kind of an all out effort, and you're going to be strengthening your heart, your lungs, your muscles. You're going to ultimately become overall like more powerful with doing that. But each one of these has their place. I really like to work them in and out of people's programs depending upon the time of the year, what they're trying to get out of it, and what they really need in that moment. So it's a fun little thing that you can add into your training. I really think that there's a lot of value in it. But like I said, it can also be very taxing on the nervous system. So if you're doing it once a week is plenty enough. We don't need to do any of these interval style trainings more than once a week. But I really want people to at least have something of that higher intensity in their regimen, especially if they're more of like a low and slow style athlete. There's a lot of benefit to the higher intensity stuff that will translate well over to your low and slow training. With all that being said, I appreciate you watching or listening, sticking around to the end. Please like, subscribe, comment. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me at Outlier Athlete. More than happy to help anyone out and just answer questions. I like being a resource. So thanks so much for sticking to the end, and I'll catch you in the next one.